So what I want to do today is go through the 4 papers by Bion himself, and I want to talk about them in chronological order. So let's start with the 1957 paper, Differentiation of the Psychotic from the Non-Psychotic Personalities. So in the very first paragraph, it seems a bit misleading. It's important to understand that he's talking about psychotic and non-psychotic parts of every person. He's not just talking about psychotic people versus neurotic or normal people. He's talking about the 2 layers of the mind, which Melanie Klein calls paranoid, schizoid, and depressive. Paranoid schizoid position is the psychotic personality, and the depressive position is the non-psychotic personality. And he distinguishes the psychotic part on the basis of its minute splitting of the part of the personality, which is what Freudians would call the ego. I mean, Bion is talking about the ego. He's talking about an attack on the ego, the minute splitting of the ego, because it is the ego that is the part of the personality concerned with awareness of internal and external reality. Reality cannot be tolerated, and therefore it is attacked. And not only is the object attacked, but the ego, capable of knowing the object, is also attacked. And then there is projection of the fragments. Projection of the fragments of both the object and fragments of the ego that could know the object. All of this is projected out. Projective identification. The result is what Bion calls bizarre objects. And bizarre objects contain bits of the object to which are attached bits of the fragmented ego. So these are peculiar objects that have ego in them. That is, they contain psychological states in the object, and therefore seem bizarre. I think both mythology and cinema contain many depictions of these bizarre objects. The monster, the bad object, is attacked. You cut off its head, only now it grows 20 more heads. The object is attacked, and it turns into a swarm of bad objects, which contain elements of ego or personality. So the person now feels persecuted by a multitude of objects, bad objects. I don't have the biblical passage from the New Testament where Jesus is casting out devils, and the devil says to him, "We are legion." A legion of demons, a multitude of demons. All of this being, in my view, a metaphorical depiction of the understanding of fragmentation and the creation of bizarre objects. And he casts the demons into a herd of swine, and the swine go off the cliff. We don't need to go to the New Testament. We can go to Walt Disney and look at The Sorcerer's Apprentice. There are a million film depictions of this fragmentation of the bad object and its multiplication. Okay. This is 1957. One of the troubling things about this paper is that at this time, Bion is really speaking a great deal about the patient's endowment. That is, he's talking about not just environmental factors in producing these psychotic phenomena, but he's talking about a preponderance of destructive impulses, a hatred of reality. He's talking about greed, and he certainly acknowledges environmental factors, but he equally acknowledges innate endowment. And this is at a point in 1957 before his theory of container-contained really comes into play. We'll see as we go along, he is increasingly, he never entirely negates the role of temperament and constitutional factors, but he is increasingly emphasizing failures of early containment. But that's not evident so much in this paper in 1957. Okay, he talks about the thinness of the transference that psychotic patients create. It's premature. The transference with neurotic patients, the transference takes many months to develop. In the psychotic patient, the transference is there almost from the beginning, but it's very thin, and yet it's tenacious. In this paper, he argues that the ego is never wholly withdrawn from reality in psychosis. It's never wholly withdrawn from reality. There's an omnipotent fantasy intended to destroy either reality or the awareness of it. The result of this omnipotent fantasy intended to destroy reality or the awareness of it is a state, he says, that is neither life nor death. In other places he calls it stupor, a psychotic stupor, a kind of catatonic state would be the extreme result of these efforts to destroy reality or the awareness of reality. But he says that even in the most extreme cases of psychosis, there is a non-psychotic personality operative at the same time as the psychotic personality. Even in the most severe psychotic, there is a neurotic. I think we can turn it around and say that just as in every neurotic, there is a psychotic part. The withdrawal from reality is an illusion, not a fact. It results from the use of projective identification against the ego. It's a fantasy that reality has been destroyed. Reality has not been destroyed. The object has not been destroyed. It's a fantasy, an omnipotent fantasy. The patient acts as if his perceptual apparatus could be split into minute fragments and projected into his objects. It's important that he sees this as illusion, as fantasy. Each particle of the split object is felt to consist of a real object which is then encapsulated in a piece of personality that has engulfed it. So the objects are split into fragments, and the fragments are engulfed by parts of the ego. And the nature of the psychotic delusion and the way it operates depends on what part of the ego has been projected into the object. This is a fairly interesting concept. So the object might be a gramophone, a record player, and how the patient reacts to that depends on what part of the ego he has put into it. If the piece of personality is concerned with sight, the gramophone, when played, is felt to be watching. If the piece of personality is concerned with hearing, then when the gramophone is played, it is felt to be listening. And the objects swell up. You can see this in certain film depictions, where the bad object swells up, so to speak, and suffuses and controls the piece of personality that engulfs it. Okay, he goes on to state that in psychosis, words are the things they name. There's no distinction between the word and the thing it names. There's no distinction between the menu and the meal. There's no distinction between the map and the territory. Here he's covering the same ground as Hannah Siegel. This is the distinction between symbolic representation, the map, and symbolic equation. In symbolic equation, the distinction between word and thing, map and territory, is lost. This is an attack also on a link, and we're going to see much more of that in the paper Attacks on Linking. Awareness of psychic reality depends on the capacity for verbal thought, the foundation of which he had previously linked with the depressive position. He's now postulating a kind of pre-verbal symbolism. Beneath the depressive position is the paranoid schizoid position. In the depressive position we have verbal thought, but in the paranoid schizoid position, he believes there is a precursor of verbal thought, which he associates with what he calls ideographs. A primitive kind of thought based on ideographs, images, and sight, rather than words and hearing. This sounds very much like Lacan. This sounds very much like the distinction between the symbolic, which would, Lacan's symbolic, which would correspond with the depressive position, and Lacan's imaginary, which would correspond to this paranoid schizoid pre-verbal language. Verbal thought is bound up with awareness of psychic reality, as opposed to early pre-verbal thought. Again, he's emphasizing endowment. He's saying the psychotic. He refers to the psychotic's over-endowment with destructiveness. Later on, he would be more emphasizing failures of containment. Metaphor can't be used. Similarities are equated. So symbols can't be created. Symbols depend on awareness of the distinction between the symbol and what it signifies. I've earlier criticized Bion for emphasizing linking as opposed to separating. He does. I don't want to make that absolute. He recognizes differentiation. He recognizes the importance of differentiation. He just puts such a tremendous emphasis on connection and linking. It's not that he doesn't see the importance of separating at all, but he tends to downplay it and overemphasize linking, in my opinion. Okay. He talks about the patient's effort to take back in what has been expelled. And he has the idea that what has been expelled, if it's going to be taken back in, it has to be taken back by the same route through which it was expelled. And he talks about violent reactions of patients when they begin to take back in. They feel assaulted, raped, penetrated, invaded in often very painful ways when what they have ejected they are attempting to bring back in. He's saying that on the non-psychotic level, the mechanism of repression that we know from neurosis, in the depressive position, neurosis, repression, but in the psychotic part of the mind, we don't have repression, we have massive splitting and projective identification. This is just Klein, really. Some of the clinical material that he describes on page 272 of this paper I find hard to relate to. It has that quality of concreteness that some of the early Kleinian work has. Kleinians kind of got away from talking about body parts and feces and in this very literalistic language. I think Bion gets away from it as he moves more and more towards his theory of thinking. But he does approach here the important theme in his work, which I think is an existential theme. That is, he refers to the patient's decision, the early decision, either to accept frustration and try to modify frustration by thinking, as opposed to the decision to reject frustration and to expel the pain. On page 272, he talks about something that, again, reminds me of Lacan's idea of the symptom. He talks about the patient's attempt to mobilize the ideograph, the primitive pre-verbal type of symbol, needed by the psychotic part of the personality for an immediate repair of the ego damaged by the excessive projective identification. Okay, so the patient has damaged his mental apparatus. He's attacked and damaged his ego. In other words, if we want to think of the Borromean knots, they have come undone. The rings have come undone. The ego has been fragmented. The patient is trying to reintegrate. And he's trying to use this pre-verbal type of symbolism, the ideograph, in order to somehow repair his ego and bring himself together again. Reminds me a little bit of the Lacanian idea of the symptom. He begins to talk about the role of what he calls the ego-destructive superego in psychosis, or in the psychotic part of the personality. On page 273, he calls it a conscience, by which he means superego. I make that distinction between conscious and superego. We know that Freud often used the word conscience to refer to superego. He used the terms interchangeably. I think Bion here, in referring to conscience, is clearly referring to a superego that punished him partly for getting rid of bad objects, getting rid of pain. So we have an incredibly harsh superego that is feared. Well, we see this in patients all of the time. I saw it in a very frightening way yesterday in a man who has been seriously suicidal, and recognizes that he has something in him that wants to kill him. He has something in him that is out to destroy him. And he and I are forming an alliance to revolt against and rebel and hopefully disempower that superego, which is the enemy of the analysis. Well, it's not just the enemy of the analysis, it's the enemy of his life. So Bion is quite aware of this incredibly cruel and killing superego. Well, Freud too. Freud referred to a superego that is, quotes, a pure culture of the death instinct. On the final page, or the next to final page, 274 of this paper, we have this, I'm sorry, I can't do anything else but call it what it is, an error on Bion's part. At the top of the page, he refers to destructive splitting and projective identification. I described the inception of verbal thought as appertaining to the depressive position, but the depression that is proper to this phase is itself something to which the psychotic personality objects. The depression that is proper to this phase, he says, depressive position. I'm sorry, there is no depression in the depressive position. It's an error to say that depression is proper to this phase, depressive position. What's proper to the depressive position is depressive anxiety, concern, guilt, not depression. Sadness, not depression. This error continues throughout all of Bion's work. I don't know why he's never been called on that error. But I have to say, it's common when very prominent psychoanalysts have glaring errors in their work, they're often not called on this. I wrote a paper about Heinrich Racker, who makes a similar kind of error, and no one calls him on it for 60 years. These errors just go on being repeated. There's a lack of critical thinking in psychoanalysis. I guess it goes with the reverence and the idealization that we saw so much in the Symingtons. I mean, when you create a demigod out of Freud, Klein, and Bion, then you're going to spare them from critical thinking. It seems sacrilegious to engage in criticism. Okay. I think we've covered most of the main points in this article. Let's move on to the next. And of all of these articles, surprisingly, the one that I find most interesting is this little paper called On Arrogance. This is the following year, 1958. This is a very interesting clinical paper. He says, well, first of all, he distinguishes what he clarifies what he means by arrogance. Pride sometimes becomes self-respect, but at other times, when death instincts predominate, pride becomes arrogance. So we're talking about two kinds of pride. Now, of course, this distinction echoes Jean-Jacques Rousseau's famous distinction between amour-propre and amour de soi. Amour-propre versus amour de soi. This is the distinction between narcissism, amour-propre, and genuine self-esteem, amour de soi. Narcissistic omnipotence and grandiosity on the one hand versus genuine, authentic self-respect and self-esteem on the other hand. This is what Bion is talking about here. He goes on to talk about the Oedipus myth. And he's talking about the role of grandiosity and narcissism, really. The arrogance of Oedipus. The arrogance of Oedipus vowing to lay bare the truth at no matter what cost. And he's making a parallel here between the arrogant Oedipus and the analyst. The analyst, like Oedipus, is arrogantly going to lay bare the truth, what he sees as the truth, at no matter what cost. Well, Oedipus ends up blinded. So he's trying to talk in this paper about something that goes seriously wrong in the analysis when the analyst persists arrogantly in pushing her vision of what's going on with the patient and in the analysis. The analyst has her theory and she's advancing it in her interpretations. Okay, he says, when you hear patients talking about something arrogant, something stupid, what's really going on is that the analyst is being arrogant and narcissistic and stupid. Because the analyst is insisting on verbal analysis, while refusing the patient's mode of communication. This is what Bion is concluding. What's he mean? The patient is operating on the level of the paranoid schizoid position, which is pre-verbal. The patient is trying to communicate in a pre-verbal manner. The patient is trying to communicate through projective identification. Following this paper, Robert Lange's talked about the three fields of psychoanalytic work, A, B, and C. A is neurotic verbal communication through metaphor, interpretable symbols. Type B is what Bion is talking about here. These are patients who don't communicate through verbal, interpretable verbal metaphor, symbols. They communicate by sticking their emotions into us, inducing through projective identification. But if the analyst doesn't get this, if the analyst doesn't understand that this patient is not a verbally communicating patient, but a patient who is communicating in this other way, if the analyst insists on carrying on with verbal communication, then the poor patient is dealing with an analyst that the patient regards as arrogant and stupid. And the whole analysis becomes a kind of battle. He talks about the curious analyst. Analyst is curious, trying to interpret. But the analyst doesn't understand that a kind of disaster has happened. The analyst is curious, but too arrogant and stupid to contain and detoxify beta elements that are being projected. The patient's trying to get the analyst to do what the mother failed to do adequately. Okay, so it's only a year later than the paper we already talked about, but already container-contained is coming more to the prominence in Bion's thinking, I think. The analyst, mother, is curious but too arrogant and stupid to contain and detoxify beta elements that are being projected. Oh, also in this paper he makes clear that the confusional states, and this is a point worth making, the confusional states of psychotic patients, how does the Freudian understand that? He understands it as a breakdown of boundaries between I and not I. Boundaries that have been painfully evolved are breaking down, and the patient is falling back into primary narcissism, which is a state Freud believed of undifferentiation, no boundaries, oceanic, primary narcissism. Patient has fallen back. Therefore, the Freudian analyst sits the patient up off the couch, really stops doing analysis, starts doing reality therapy, because civilization has collapsed back into a primordial chaos. And we have to get the patient out of chaos. Well, for the Kleinian, of course, there is no primordial chaos. There is no primary narcissism. There is no undifferentiation at the beginning. So what are the confusional states? It's not a regression to primary narcissism. It's a confusion brought about by intense use of projective identification. Patient is putting so much of himself into me, taking so much of me into himself, that he's now confused about what's me and what's him. This is not regression to primary narcissism. It's a pathological state of confusion brought about by the intense use of projective identification. So we need to understand that. So in the analysis, there are references to blindness, stupidity, curiosity, and arrogance. And these references are attempts by the patient to tell us that we don't get it. There's been a catastrophe. They can't communicate the way we want them to communicate. They can only communicate the way they can communicate, through projective identification. The analytic procedure has become an acting out of destructive attacks launched against the ego. But that's when the analyst can't contain. You could say the analytic procedure has become an acting out of destructive attacks on the part of the analyst, on the part, attacking the patient, with an insistence that the patient straighten up and fly right and communicate the way we want him to communicate, verbally, with metaphor that we can interpret. But he can't. He's not in the depressive position. On page 145, the third paragraph, he's talking about the qualities required to pursue the truth, the capacity to tolerate the stresses associated with the introjection of another person's projective identifications, containing split-off aspects, while retaining a balanced outlook. Okay, he's talking here about the analyst's ideal of being able to pursue the truth and to retain a balanced outlook. But somehow this leads to outbreaks of envy and hatred. Okay, the analyst is trying to be balanced. The analyst is trying to be cool. The analyst is trying to retain her composure. But the more the analyst is able to contain her composure, the more attacking the patient becomes. Why? Because the analyst's very ability to stay calm and composed inflames the patient's envy and hatred. Bion is getting insight into this. The analyst is trying to remain a professional, calm, composed. This drives the patient crazy. It inflames intense envy. Or either that or they think you're stupid. I mean, look, don't you understand I'm insulting you, I'm attacking you, and you're sitting there remaining calm and composed? You don't understand? Are you stupid? I'm insulting you, I'm devaluing you, I'm mocking you, and you're sitting there calm and composed? You must be so superior to me. I couldn't be calm. Either that or you're just really dumb. I don't know which it is what the patient is thinking. The other paper that beautifully addresses this is a paper by Lawrence Epstein that appeared, I think it's on the PEP web, something about therapeutic uses of hatred in the countertransference. I think it's contained in the book that Epstein and Steiner did called Countertransference. It's a collection of papers. Paper by Lawrence Epstein, and he refers here to Les Miserables. In Les Miserables, the criminal steals the bishop's silver candlesticks and so on, and he's caught by the gendarme. And the bishop comes and says, no, 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 this man didn't steal these things. I gave them to him as a gift. And so the bishop's goodness causes Valjean, the criminal, to convert and repent. In the face of the bishop's loving goodness, the patient changes and repents. And Epstein says many of us have come into the field of psychotherapy with the unconscious fantasy that that's how we're going to cure people, through our goodness and love. Well, sometimes with a few mildly disturbed people, maybe that works. With seriously ill people, it doesn't work very well, especially with a certain class of patient, that our goodness, our containment, drives them crazy. Okay? Okay, so Bion is saying in this paper, when you hear references in your patient's material to curiosity, arrogance, and stupidity, you should consider that this is what's happening, that you're trying to analyze the patient as if he was in D when in fact he's in PS. In that kind of situation, analyst and patient together form a frustrated couple, he says. They're operating with two different theories of communication. The patient starts wondering whether I could stand it. Sometimes he referred to something that I was able to stand, which he apparently could not stand. Patient points out that Bion can't stand it. Not clear what it was. Some kind of creative relationship which was made intolerable to the persecuting object through envy and hate of the creative couple. Initially, that's what he thought. But then he decides that's not it. It's really not envy and hate of creative coupling. That's not really the problem. The real problem was that the analyst is not containing the patient's projective identifications. Okay, so initially Bion is thinking the problem here is the patient's envy and hate. The patient can't stand any creative coupling. It can't stand any creative linking. And then he says, no, that's not it. The real answer is that the analyst is insisting on verbal communication as a method of analyzing the patient's problems, which the patient feels as an attack on his method of communication, which is a very different method of communication. My use of verbal communication was felt by the patient to be a mutilating attack on his methods of communication, which is to project the split-off parts of his psyche into me. Now, it's as if the patient is hoping that if he can put these bad feelings into you and leave them there long enough, they will be modified by their sojourn in your psyche. That is, they will be modified by your alpha function. He doesn't have enough alpha function. He has hardly any alpha function. So he's putting them into you so that they can be detoxified. You become the uncontaining mother. This is you could say he's created a transference. He's turned you into he's found in you the original uncontaining mother. Okay, so this is a paper about the Freudian Lacanian addiction to words. That's a nice title. I got to write a paper about that. The Freudian Lacanian addiction to words, to the idea that what we're doing is a talking cure. Well, these patients, for them, it's not a talking cure. At least not until later. Eventually it becomes a talking cure if your containment and detoxification can work, and the patient may move into a space where talking becomes helpful. Okay, that's this paper. That's a very interesting paper. So the next time you hear references in your patient's material to arrogance, stupidity, curiosity, your patient might be telling you, listen, I'm trying to communicate in a way that you're not getting. Okay, the third paper is the famous attacks on linking. We've already talked about this to a considerable extent. He gives all of these clinical vignettes. All of these vignettes are examples of destructive attacks on a link. And of this minute fragmentation that he has spoken of. Attacks on linking. This is an attack on coupling. An attack on the state of mind of the coupling parents. The Freudian theory of the primal scene is brought by Bion into the mind. The primal scene is an intolerable linking, an intolerable coupling, an intolerable intercourse. But thinking involves coupling. It involves coupling a preconception with a realization, out of which can come conception. But if you can't tolerate intercourse, if you can't tolerate this linking of two, which generates a third, then you can't think. So the coupling is attacked, the linking is attacked in order to forestall envy. Envy of the parents in intercourse. I mean, why is the primal scene so unbearable? I think mainly it's unbearable not because I think it's reductionistic to say it's unbearable because father is getting something with mother that I'm not allowed to get, or mother is getting something from father that I'm not allowed to get. That's the Freudian way of understanding it. I think it's more about the fact that when the parents are having intercourse, it's evident to me that their minds are not on me. They're totally preoccupied with each other. The last thing they're thinking about is me. You know, what am I? Chopped liver? I mean, don't I not matter? Aren't they supposed to care about me? They're obviously not caring about me. So, I mean, I think that kind of narcissistic issue is at the core of why the primal scene is so unbearable. Anyway, if you can't bear it, you can't think. Okay. The couple engaged in a creative act are felt to be sharing an enviable emotional experience. Patient feels that he's the excluded party. Generating hatred and murderous attacks on links, on what links the pair and on the pair itself, and on the object generated by the pair. He then begins to, in this paper, go over the ground of that other paper, Curiosity, Arrogance, and Stupidity. He repeats that contribution in this paper. He makes the distinction in this paper between normal and pathological projective identification. Normal projective identification is for the purposes of communication. Patient projects himself into me to let me know how it feels to be him. Pathological projective identification involves this minute fragmentation. It's much more motivated by destructiveness than by any wish to link. In other words, it's more of an attack on links than an attempt to link. again, he goes over the whole idea that if the analyst can contain what's being projected, it can be modified and turned into a form, detoxified, turned into a form that can be safely reintrojected. He refers on page 313 to a mother who could not tolerate experiencing such feelings and reacted either by denying them ingress, not letting them come in, or alternatively becoming a prey to the anxiety which resulted from introjection of the infant's feelings. She either doesn't let them in, or having let them in, she becomes anxious. In either case, the process of putting the beta elements into the mother or the analyst and having the analyst be able to contain and subject them to alpha function breaks down. On page 313, he says, I do not put forward this experience as the cause of the patient's disturbance. That finds its main source in the inborn constitution of the infant, he says. Okay, so this is 1959. He is using container-contain, but he's telling the psychoanalytic world, look, I'm not going crazy with container-contain. I'm not one-sidedly emphasizing the mother. I'm not engaged in mother blaming. He's saying, no, this failures of containment are not the cause. I'm not overestimating the environmental factor, he says. Let's not forget about inborn factors of disposition, temperament, and so on. He's still talking about primary aggression and envy here. Over time, the balance is shifting more and more towards the environment. In other words, more and more we're thinking of what looks like primary envy and aggression as already a breakdown due to failures of containment. Okay. Final page of this paper. Projective identification often makes it possible for him to investigate his own feelings in a personality powerful enough to contain them. Denial of the use of this mechanism, either by the refusal of the mother to serve as a repository of the infant's feelings, or by the hatred and envy of the patient who cannot allow the mother to exercise his function. Okay, so there's both sides. It's either the mother's inability or refusal of containment, or the patient who can't allow the mother to contain. Leads to a destruction of the link. Well, why could the patient not allow the mother to contain? Well, we've all seen this mechanism. I wouldn't resort to any notion of inborn constitution, although I wouldn't deny the possibility, but I mean, we encounter patients who bite the hand that feeds them. So now they're in the presence of a containing analyst who's able to contain and willing to contain, but the patient can't let you contain. Why? Well, because the original mother couldn't contain. And it's as if the patient is saying, so now you show up. a good container? Where were you when I needed you? Fuck you. It's too late. Also, if they were to allow themselves to recognize your ability to contain, that displays to them in a traumatic way what they missed, what they didn't have, what they lost. For them to see what you can do is unbearably painful to them because they didn't have it when they needed it. And now it feels too late anyway. I don't think it is too late, but it feels too late. It's too painful to go there. It's almost re-traumatizing. It's almost re-traumatizing. Again, he ends with the superego, the ego-destructive superego. Early development of the superego affected by this kind of mental functioning. Destructive superego. And this contributes to the psychotic patient's inability to face the depressive position. So the threat, the move towards the depressive position threatens a severe superego attack. So what are the two dangers? You could say what Bion is saying, that in the paranoid schizoid position, the fear is of a persecutory attack by the bad objects, the bizarre objects. Like if you disturb a hornet's nest, 1,000 hornets are attacking you. So in PS, the fear is of attack by a swarm of bad objects, bizarre objects. In D, in the depressive position, the fear is of an attack by a severely hostile superego, condemning. Okay. So that's attacks on linking. I wrote a paper, as I've mentioned, called Attacks on Separating, because obviously psychopathology is not just attacks on linking, it's also attacks on boundaries. So if we're going to appreciate Bion's wonderful work on attacks on linking, we need also to pay attention to the forms of pathology which involve an attack on separating. I've made the point that in order for linking to take place, there has to be separating. I mean, if there's only one object, there's nothing to link with. So we have to have a separation of the one into two in order for the two to link and create three. Okay? If there's only one, there's no linking. The one has to be differentiated into two so that the two can then pair and create a third. Okay. Moving on to the final paper, 1962, The Psychoanalytic Study of Thinking. This is a very tightly written, clear, but very tightly written paper. It's quite I think it's a tour de force. I think it's a kind of a masterpiece in about 5 pages. There is this element of Bion that I've already indicated I have trouble with. On the first page, 306, he says, thinking has to be called into existence to cope with thoughts. Thinking is a development forced on the psyche by the pressure of thoughts and not the other way round. So it's as if we have thoughts without a thinker. Well, where are these thoughts without a thinker? In the proto-mental realm, these poor thoughts are lying around waiting for a thinker to come and think them. I have trouble with this way of thinking. On the other hand, I acknowledged that in my own case, I had to wait to find a container. In my case, it was a woman analyst who knew something about babies and mothers before I could really think the thoughts I needed to think about my troubled relationship with my mother. I had to find a woman analyst who could contain and enable me to think these thoughts. So I suppose metaphorically you could say there were thoughts somehow there before I could think them. But I don't know. I find this a peculiar way of approaching this whole subject. Anyway. So we've already discussed the whole process of the preconception, finding a realization, leading to a conception, and then finally to concepts and theories. This is the grid, which we've already discussed in detail. He points out with Melanie Klein that the infant comes with an inborn expectation, almost an a priori knowledge of the breast, an empty thought. The baby comes expecting that there will be this good object, and it proceeds to seek and hopefully find it. When the breast doesn't appear, instead of a realization of a breast, we have a realization of a no breast. The no breast is the absent breast. And faced with the no breast, I have to make a decision. Do I try to bear this frustration and modify the frustration into thought? Or do I seek to escape the frustration? If the capacity for toleration of frustration is sufficient, no breast inside becomes a thought, and an apparatus for thinking develops. A capacity for tolerating frustration thus enables the psyche to develop thought, to tolerate no breast, turn it into a thought. If the capacity for frustration is not adequate, the no breast is unbearable. What should be a thought? That is, what should be a thought should be the juxtaposition of a preconception with a negative realization. Instead, it becomes not a thought, it becomes a bad object, indistinguishable from a thing in itself, suitable only for evacuation. It becomes something like a beta element that must be evacuated. Evacuation of a bad breast becomes synonymous with obtaining sustenance from a good breast. There's a nub of pathology. Instead of seeking and hopefully finding sustenance from a good breast, one instead lives on the principle that evacuating a bad breast is the same thing as getting sustenance from a good breast. Yeah, but you see, in my mind, this is very close to what people are trying to get at with the concept of death instinct. I mean, if the life principle is operative, you're going to base your life on trying to get sustenance from a good breast. But if the death instinct is predominating, then you're going to live on the basis of evacuating the bad breast. If tolerance, oh, he makes a mistake here. On page 307, paragraph 10. I think this might be a typo. He says, if tolerance of frustration is not too great, modification becomes the governing aim. If tolerance, does he mean intolerance? I think the words IN have been left off. And what's printed here is tolerance when what should be printed here is intolerance. He means to say if intolerance of frustration is not too great. Or the other way around, we could say if tolerance of frustration is not too little. Okay? But that sentence is incorrect. I'm getting an image of myself as an old-fashioned public school teacher who marks your papers by putting either a check or an X. The dominance of Oh, and here's another mistake. Page 307, paragraph 11, he writes, the dominance of protective identification. It should be projective identification, not protective identification. That's a misprint of some kind. I'm not blaming Bion, that's the editor. The dominance of projective identification confuses the distinction between the self and the external object. This contributes to the absence of any perception of two-ness, since such an awareness depends on the recognition of a distinction between subject and object. Okay, here is Bion recognizing the importance of distinctions, separations, not just links. He talks in the next paragraph, the relationship with time was graphically brought home to me by a patient who said over and over again that he was wasting time and continued to waste it. The patient's aim is to destroy time by wasting it. The consequences are illustrated in the description in Alice in Wonderland of the Mad Hatter's tea party. It was always 4 o'clock. Now that's interesting. I mean, Heidegger wrote a whole philosophical masterpiece called Being and Time. What is the repetition compulsion? The repetition, the unconscious compulsion to repeat. That's an attempt to freeze time. That's an attempt to negate time. It's always 4 o'clock. The woman always cheats on me. The woman always abandons me. The man always abuses me, betrays me. And people, of course, caught in the repetition compulsion, they arrange for this to happen over and over again. In other words, they arrange for it always to be 4 o'clock. There can be no surprise. There can be no change. Time doesn't exist. This is the repetition compulsion. We live in eternity instead of in time. Well, time becomes real in the depressive position. Time isn't real in the paranoid schizoid position. Okay, he's talking about if there is, next page, 308 at the top, if intolerance of frustration is not so great as to activate the mechanisms of evasion, and yet too great to bear dominance of the reality principle, the personality develops omnipotence as a substitute for the mating of the preconception or conception with the negative realization. This involves the assumption of omniscience. So he's talking about omnipotence and omniscience, two of the three classical characteristics of God, which are omnipotence, all-powerful, omniscience, all-knowing, benevolent, all-good. Omnipotence and omniscience are substituted for learning from experience by the aid of thoughts and thinking. Instead of thinking, we become omnipotent and omniscient. Then because we can't think, we can't discriminate between true and false. Omniscience substitutes for the discrimination between true and false a dictatorial affirmation that one thing is morally right and the other wrong. The assumption of omniscience that denies reality ensures that the morality thus engendered is a function of psychosis. Okay, I have problems with this. There seems to be a rationalist bias here. He's associating morality, a certain kind of assertion of morality, distinguishing good and evil, right and morally right and wrong. He's associating that with a failure to think. Okay, I mean, that's the rationalist. The rationalist bias, which we already addressed in discussing Bion's group psychology, where the emphasis is on the rational leadership of Ralph and Piggy, and insufficient place is given to Simon as a kind of conscience, a moral leader. Bion associates thinking entirely with a kind of means and rationality. He seems to not make a place for moral reasoning, as if somehow moral reasoning is a paranoid schizoid, omnipotent and omniscient alternative to healthy thinking. A real bias here, it seems to me. He goes on to have more to say on page 308 about the ego-destructive superego. It behaves as if it felt that an internal object has been built up that has the characteristics of a greedy vagina-like breast that strips of its goodness all that the infant receives or gives, leaving only degenerate objects. This internal object starves its host of all understanding. He then goes on to speak about alpha function and makes a distinction between two types of consciousness, a kind of basic consciousness, and then a more advanced type of consciousness. I think really this he's getting at the same distinction that Jean-Paul Sartre was addressing when he distinguished a pre-reflective consciousness from a reflective consciousness. which is also a reprise, really, of George Herbert Mead's distinction between the I and the me, the two components of the self. Any self that I know, that I have a concept of or an image of, is my reflective self, the me, which always excludes the I subject who is knowing the me at any particular time. So here we have this important distinction, and for Bion, it's only with the capacity for reflective consciousness that we get a contact barrier and we can have some sense of an unconscious resonating beneath consciousness. In other words, it's only in the depressive position, really, that you can have a reflective consciousness capable of having contact with an unconscious. He goes on to speak of nameless dread. Here he's talking about the infant psyche. If its projections are not accepted by the mother, the infant feels that it is dying or stripped of such meaning as it has. It therefore introjects not a fear of dying, but made tolerable, but a nameless dread. The infant feels it's dying. The mother can't contain the projection of the feeling that it's dying. The infant feels nameless dread. Nameless, without names, that is, unsymbolized. Mother, of course, names the world for us, generating what the sociologists Berger and Luckman called a nomos, a named world, as opposed to an anomic world. So we're talking here about anomie, about a nameless dread, resulting from severe failures of containment and processing by alpha function. He distinguishes between an understanding object and a projective identification rejecting object. And we saw this in the paper on arrogance, where the analyst is not understanding, but rejecting the patient's projective identifications, insisting on treating the patient as if this were a depressive position patient, as if this were a neurotic with whom one could work verbally, when in fact the patient is a paranoid schizoid patient who can't access the verbal and communicates in a very different way, namely by projective identification. And the treatment then becomes a battleground between an arrogant analyst and a stupid analyst, Bion would say, who just doesn't get that he's with a patient who communicates in a different way, but the analyst is insisting on his way of communicating and rejecting the patient's way of communicating. Here he goes on to distinguish evacuative projective identification from communicative projective identification. What's the difference? In both cases, the patient is inducing his feelings in us, but in communicative projective identification, the induction is a gentler kind of penetration in the service of understanding. The patient puts his feelings into us so that we can get a sense of what it feels like to be him. From our point of view, we have a sense of these feelings that have been put into us, but they've been put into us rather more gently. With evacuative projective identification, it's more like rape. The feelings have been violently put into us in a way that, instead of helping us think, in fact destroys our capacity to think. A destructive form of projective identification rather than a positive communicative form. In paragraph 23, Bion goes on to talk about the gap between cognizance and appreciation of lack and action designed to modify the lack. Okay, sounds again rather Lacanian. Here's the emphasis on lack and a distinction between being able to bear and appreciate lack as opposed to having to evacuate unbearable sense of lack. Bottom of page 309, he points out that we are political or social animals, and we can't find fulfillment outside a group, and we can't satisfy any emotional drive without expression of its social component. His impulses, and I mean all impulses and not merely his sexual ones, are at the same time narcissistic, Bion writes. Quotes, "The problem is the resolution of the conflict between narcissism and socialism." Okay, so here again he's being Kleinian. Freud saw the fundamental human problem as a mind-body problem, or a culture-nature problem. Up here on the level of mind and culture, we have ego, rationality, and we have superego, morality, forever in conflict with an id, which has its roots in the body. So we have a body-mind, human-animal conflict for Freud. Klein says, no, that's not the issue. The issue is a human psyche torn between love on the one hand and hate on the other. And Bion is essentially repeating this. A human psyche torn between narcissism on the one hand and socialism on the other. Between narcissism and conscience. Between hate and love. At the end of the paper, on page 310, he writes that it is as if starvation of truth is somehow analogous to alimentary starvation. The mind needs truth the way the body needs food. And a sense of truth is experienced if the view of an object which is hated can be conjoined to a view of the same object when it is loved. And the conjunction confirms that the object experienced by different emotions is the same object. A correlation is established. This is simply the overcoming of splitting and the achievement of the depressive position.